Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a good week and staying warm and sane, most importantly. Everything feels awful right now, so I hope that you're all taking care of yourselves the best you can, even if that just means staring at a wall or screaming into the void. I thought about postponing this video and doing one instead on everything that's going on right now and how we're feeling here in Canada about Trump and having our existence as a nation threatened. But I already had the script for this one written, and honestly, I don't even think I can have a rational conversation right now about the US because I am so angry. I guess leave me a comment if you're interested in a rant video and maybe we can do that next. Anyway, I have a couple of life updates because it's been a while. Apparently I am incapable of getting videos out more than once a month these days, but you know, that's how it goes. So if you're interested in life updates, then stick around for this part. But if not, that's totally fine. You can just skip to the timestamp that's somewhere here on the screen and jump straight into the good stuff. In my last video, I mentioned that my dog Bonsai had been diagnosed with cancer. Aside from all his lymph nodes being swollen, he was his usual happy, hungry self, so we decided to do chemo because he was clearly fighting, and from the very start, I told him and myself that as long as he's fighting, I'm fighting too, and when he's ready to give up, then we'll give up. The chemo did a good job at shrinking his tumors and his cancer cell count, and he had almost no side effects from it. He threw up like one time, but that was it. So we were hopeful for a remission. Then about 6 weeks into chemo, he stopped responding and the cancer bounced back before we could reach full remission. We took him for further testing and found out that he has B-cell indolent lymphoma, which is a slow-growing cancer that doesn't respond to typical chemo. The good news is that the life expectancy with this particular type of cancer is a little bit longer, so we're looking at keeping him on a low dose of chemo that he'll get every 3 weeks for the rest of his life, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to have another year or two with him since he seems to be doing fine otherwise. So it is the best of a bad situation, which I'm grateful for, and it is nice to have like some good news in the midst of all this ridiculousness that's been going on. And speaking of good news, my other life update is I'm getting married. My partner and I got engaged a couple of weeks ago and we're getting married this August. We're planning a very small, very informal wedding in my parents' backyard because we really want it to be a celebration of community and of queer love in the face of so much hate and bigotry right now. Neither of us are particularly enthusiastic about event planning, so we're keeping it very low-key and informal, but we do want to make sure that our wedding is accessible and sensory-friendly for neurodivergent folk, of whom we know a lot, ourselves included. And so if any of you have experience with sensory-friendly events, either from organizing or attending them or both, drop me a comment because I would love to hear from you. And that's a nice segue into today's topic, which is about neurodivergence. In this video, I want to do something a little different by talking about my diagnosis and how being neurodivergent affects me. Usually, I try to steer away from talking about myself too much on this channel because I'd rather give you information that's helpful to you, but in the time leading up to and just after my diagnosis, I found myself binge watching a lot of content by other neurodivergent folk talking about their symptoms and diagnoses. I found this very helpful and it gave me a sense of community knowing that other people out there struggle with the exact same things that I do. But I also get that it's not always helpful to hear other people's stories, and if that's where you're at, I totally get it and feel free to skip this one. I'm going to be doing a series of videos about neurodivergence where I'll offer up more information and resources, so if you're interested in the topic but maybe not so much in personal stories, then I look forward to bringing you those videos in the near future. Models of disability. In this video and in subsequent videos about neurodivergence, I'm going to occasionally refer to ADHD and autism as disabilities. I know that a lot of us have a complicated relationship with that word, and if that's you, that's okay. It's a loaded word and it doesn't always describe the experiences of every person with autism and/or ADHD. Personally, I find the word disability to be liberating because it frees me from a lot of the shame that I've been carrying around my whole life, and it helps me recognize and identify the voice of my internalized ableism. I'll talk more about that in another video, but I think it can be helpful to talk about neurodivergence this way because it also helps neurotypical people to understand that our executive functioning issues aren't our fault and they're just not going to get better by trying harder.
Advice from someone without ADHD feels like. I know you've had a hard time being on time recently, so I wanted to share a tip with you I think will help. Okay. Sort of a life hack, if you will. Great. Try to leave a bit earlier than you normally would. So like, whatever time you would normally leave like 10 minutes before that. Okay. I think that should help. Thank you.
When I'm alone in my room, I almost never feel disabled. I say almost because I also have OCD and that absolutely can and does feel disabling even when I'm alone. But that's a whole other video for another time, which I'm not going to get into right now. ADHD and autism don't make me feel disabled. In fact, I kind of love my spicy creative brain. It's only when I have to step outside and participate in the rest of the world and remember to put my keys in my bag and get to the train on time and organize my to-do list and wait in a line that I start to feel disabled. And that's not me, that's my environment just not meshing with my brain. In a society that was built by and for neurodivergent folk, autism and ADHD wouldn't be disabilities. They're not defects that need to be fixed. Yet a lot of the treatments for both use this approach. ADHD medications are designed to help with executive functioning issues.
It's entirely possible.
Which are only issues because our society is so hyper-individualized and good executive functioning is a requirement of being alone in a hyper-individualized society. In a more communal society, not everyone would need to have excellent executive functioning skills because everyday life things like cooking and cleaning and remembering to take out the trash would be done communally. There's no cure or medical treatment for autism, but a type of therapy called applied behavior analysis, or ABA, is commonly used to reduce the symptoms of autism, or more accurately, reduce the burden of autistic existence on everyone else around autistic people without actually taking into account the needs and feelings of the autistic person themselves. ABA therapy is widely hated by autistic people because the point of it is to make life easier for the non-autistic or allistic people around us by modifying our behavior in order to make us seem more normal. Basically, it's just teaching autistic people how to mask better, which research shows is actually detrimental to our health and can lead to things like depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and even suicide. I'm going to talk about that more in my next video about internalized ableism, but basically ABA therapy doesn't care about the internal lived experiences of autistic people, nor is it focused on making us more comfortable. Things like medications and ABA therapy are based on the medical model of disability, which seeks to fix anyone who deviates from the norm in any way so that they can exist more easily within our current social and economic framework. Editing Megan here, I just wanted to interrupt myself and mention that if you are someone who chooses to be on medication for your neurodivergence, then that is completely fine. This is not a judgment on people who decide to take meds, and unfortunately the reality is that we do have to exist in a neurotypical world, so if medication is the thing that helps you to do that, that is awesome. Power to you. This was not meant to knock anyone who's taking meds for ADHD whatsoever. By contrast, the social model of disability sees differences as being morally neutral. They're neither good nor bad, they're just beautiful aspects of human diversity, and instead of rigidly adhering to abled and neurotypical standards, society should adapt to be more flexible and accessible for disabled folk of all kinds, whether our disabilities are visible or not. The social model of disability identifies the systemic like barriers, derogatory attitudes, and social exclusion that make it difficult or impossible for neurodivergent people to be valued for our contributions or to function at an optimal level for us. Instead of focusing on fixing whatever's perceived to be wrong with a person who has a disability, the social model of disability focuses on fixing society to be more inclusive of people who are disabled by its rigid expectations, including people with different neurotypes. It seeks to challenge power imbalances within society between those who are disabled and those who aren't, and to redefine what disability means as a diverse expression of human life. Physical, sensory, intellectual, and psychological variations among individuals don't have to be disabling if society takes steps to include people in a way that's respectful to their individual needs. In other words, if the right accommodations are made, everyone can thrive. In a nutshell, the medical model of disability puts the responsibility of functioning onto the individual disabled person, whereas the social model of disability seeks for all of us to collectively share in the responsibility of intentionally creating a more equitable and accessible world. A world that adopts the social model of disability is a world in which neurotypical people would benefit too, because it would be more flexible and have less rigid expectations for how to behave and how to dress and when and where and how often to work. To give you an example, one of the ways my AuDHD disables me is by delaying my processing times unless I'm hyper-focused on something, which I have no control over. I'm 35 years old and I have never had a full driver's license. I've tried to learn 4 separate times, but I was never fully able to drive on my own. I've felt a lot of shame about that since I was old enough to get a license, but now I realize it's because of my disability. Because I have so many thoughts buzzing around my head all at once all the time, and because I'm constantly being overloaded with too much sensory input, it takes my brain a while to allow new information to sink in real time. This means my reaction times are slower, and when I'm talking to people, I often don't fully absorb what they're saying to me until long after the conversation is over, so I find it hard to respond in real time. This is why electronic communication like emails and text are so helpful. They allow me to read something over and over and pause and think about what I'm going to say next. But when you're driving, you have to have quick decision and reaction times and be aware of many things all at once. You have to be prepared to respond quickly and safely to unpredictability, and you have to multitask and prioritize critical information in real time. All of these things are extremely challenging and sometimes even impossible for my autistic brain. Knowing that I'm autistic and that neurotypical society disables me has allowed me to let go of a lot of the shame around not being able to drive. In fact, not driving is very common among autistic folk, with only about 34% of us being fully licensed drivers. In a world that adopts the social model of disability, things like driving would be more accessible and more neurodivergent friendly. There would be better and more extensive public transit options, which would benefit neurotypical people too, and more bike lanes and roads just built for bikes. The graduated licensing system would have less steps and be easier to navigate, which also would benefit neurotypical people, and there would be incentives for drivers who carpool, which would encourage and normalize not driving alone and having a support person who can help drivers cognitively manage, sort through, prioritize, and not get overwhelmed by all the fast-moving input. Basically, the social model of disability actually benefits everybody. When we as a society adapt to the needs of those who are disabled, then everybody benefits, even neurotypical people. There's a lot more nuance and history behind both the medical and social models of disability, but for the sake of time, that was just a broad, basic overview, and I can do a more detailed video on that later if you want. Just drop a comment and let me know if you'd be interested in that. Why are so many people autistic and/or ADHD all of a sudden? Neurodivergence is very common in my community. The Venn diagram of queer people and neurodivergence is a circle, and I'm absolutely planning a video about that too. But it's also quite common in the general population. It's estimated that about 15 to 20% of people worldwide are neurodivergent in some way, so we're a minority, but not a small one. When it comes to autism specifically, older estimates put it at about 1% of the population, but that figure has risen to 3% in recent years. That's because there's been a surge in the number of diagnoses, not just among kids, but for adults as well. Like I mentioned in my last video about trans folk, when we know more about something, we find more of it. As we learn more about neurodivergent conditions, we understand more about how symptoms can show up differently for people and yet still be part of a very specific pattern of behavior and responses. This more nuanced pattern recognition then widens our criteria for diagnosis, which then naturally encompasses more people. In the example of autism, at one point it was thought that only white boys who didn't make eye contact impact and showed a rigid interest in something niche like trains or ceiling fans were on the spectrum. Then we learned that autism is just as common in women and girls as it is in boys and men, but women are socialized differently, and because of that, we tend to mask our symptoms more to conform to social norms and expectations, thereby going undetected for much longer. Editing Megan here. This doesn't just apply to autism. ADHD in girls and women has been extremely underdiagnosed as well, because the stereotypical presentation of ADHD is the hyperactive boy who just won't sit still. Girls present with different symptoms, typically because they're socialized differently, and so ADHD in girls and women can go undiagnosed for years, sometimes even decades.
The reason why girls went profoundly misdiagnosed is because girls typically do not present those physical, jittery, interrupting kind of physical chaos. And boys present 4 key differences with ADHD than girls do. Here they are. Number 1, when a boy has ADHD, they have symptoms that appear on the surface. Impulsive behavior, fidgeting, getting distracted, being very physical with their inability to concentrate. Girls, we have the opposite symptoms. Ours are all internal. So when you're a girl with ADHD, you daydream, you're disorganized, you're hard on yourself, you make careless mistakes, you might be called a tomboy or super creative. But what happens, and this is why this is so scary, is that when you sit in life or in a classroom and you see all your friends turning things in on time or staying organized or their lockers are clean and yours is a mess and you're running late, you start to think you have a character defect. You start to think there's something wrong with you. So you turn it back on yourself. And it also gets missed because it's internal. We're not sitting there bouncing our leg and jumping and raising our hand. We have the opposite impact. The second key difference between boys and girls is that boys present earlier, typically around the age of 7. Girls, however, present later, on average, like around 12.
If any of you are interested in the history of autism and how it's been studied, I highly recommend the book Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. I read it a couple of months ago, and it's a great resource for anyone wanting to know how autism was discovered and how it's been diagnosed through the decades. The surge of women and girls being diagnosed with autism is part of what's contributed to the overall rise in diagnosed cases lately, but there are other factors that can delay diagnosis as well, including generational differences. In general, millennials and Gen Z tend to be much more literate about mental health issues than older generations. People from older generations didn't grow up with the same understanding of mental health and access to resources that we did, and they're more likely to view mental health issues as being shameful, embarrassing, or just straight up unimportant. I saw a meme once that said something along the lines of the parent who says, "That's normal, everyone struggles with that," when you explain your neurodivergence is the parent you got it from. There's just as much neurodivergence among our parents and grandparents as there is among us. They're just far less likely to be aware of it and therefore far less likely to be formally diagnosed. The gender gap. I touched on this already, but I'll go into a bit more detail here. Because autism, ADHD, and other neurodivergent conditions have historically been associated with the male presentation, a lot of clinicians aren't familiar with the different ways that neurodivergence shows up for women and girls.
What happens to the AuDHD manic pixie dream girls when we age out of the fairy princess phase? Let's get into the whole timeline. First, you've got spooky baby, and then there's fairy child, followed by old soul. If you're parentified, then you go through a people pleaser kind of teacher's pet or mommy's little helper phase, which ends with burnt out puberty alien, followed by teenage wasteland. Then you get into the manic pixie dream girl phase, during which you and your friends will get emotionally abused and have relationships with narcissists and other toxic people, which will bring on your Cassandra phase, where you're the psychic witch who can predict the bad things that are about to happen to everyone around you. From Cassandra, we turn into the most helpful person in the room, in which we try to codependently serve and please other people in order to get our needs met and prevent their and our future suffering, which leads us straight to burnt out bisexual performance artist, and wildly, some of us get famous phase. But if you don't, then next comes art teacher, eccentric art teacher, Some of us will take a branch into the wilderness. If you're outdoorsy, you might pick a biome: desert, rimland, beach witch, bog hag, take your pick. The privileged among us might graduate from higher ed around this point and become Dr. Quirky. There could even be a mermaid phase, but the domesticated variety of AuDHD femme might go into homemaking as an art form, which is what I did. That can be cottagecore lesbian, homemaking hippie, crunchy mama. I call this manic pixie dream partner. And it does get you wifed up, but watch out, because next comes MILF, maybe dog MILF for the childless among us, followed by burnt out MILF, who less people want to F. Then comes sexy librarian, followed by regular librarian. At any point along this timeline, you might come out as non-binary or full lesbian. I don't make the rules. For the pale among us, it's important to watch out for the TERF or alt-right pipelines that can draw in homemakers and black and white thinkers. For the party girls among us comes the sobriety phase. For your old age, we've got well-oiled, beautiful bald lady who wears a purple velvet cape to the art openings. There's also Mrs. Claus, and of course, the witchy woman whose house the children run past. When you die, you might go to heaven or take on your final form of Haint of the Woods or the Circled Stones. And of course, if you're very good, you'll be reincarnated as a childless couple's rescue dog.
This results in missed or delayed diagnoses for women, sometimes going undetected for decades. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety than autism, when really depression and anxiety are symptoms associated with a lifetime of masking and hiding neurodivergent traits in order to fit in. Cultural influences. Different cultures have different ways of classifying and explaining psychological phenomena. For example, one culture's schizophrenic is another culture's shaman. Cultural factors can impact diagnosis rates and result in national or ethnic disparities. Character attributions. In families where there is little awareness of neurodivergent traits or mental health symptoms, people can mistakenly attribute behaviors related to developmental differences to character traits like laziness, carelessness, not paying attention, or otherwise being bad in some way. This can be extremely damaging to a child's self-worth because kids who grow up like this internalize those messages and believe them about themselves. This is essentially the root of internalized ableism, which I'll get to later, and it can have serious repercussions for a child's trajectory in life. Racial, ethnic, and cultural bias in diagnosis. A stereotypical autistic person is a white boy, and therefore kids from Black and Brown communities have traditionally been less likely to be diagnosed with autism. On the other hand, because of the perception that ADHD makes you rowdy and out of control, Black boys may be misdiagnosed with ADHD or a conduct disorder when really they have autism, and their bad behaviors are the result of autistic meltdowns and sensory overwhelm, neither of which is their fault. Class disparity and access to resources. Individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds face more barriers when it comes to accessing a diagnosis and treatment. Private psychologists are prohibitively expensive for many, and it can cost thousands of dollars to get a diagnosis. Here in Canada, we do have publicly funded mental health care options, but the wait lists to access them are long, sometimes taking up to 2 years before you can even get in the door. This lack of access contributes to delayed or missing interventions like accommodations or IEPs, which would otherwise significantly improve the lives and well-being of neurodivergent folk. Intelligence and giftedness. Individuals who have lower support needs and are gifted in one particular area are more likely to be missed in diagnosis because their abilities may compensate for their challenges, so they go undetected. In other words, they're better at masking. Their neurodivergent traits may also be interpreted as bad, leading to internalized blame, shame, and a pervasive sense of brokenness. Masking. Masking refers to the practice of hiding or minimizing your neurodivergent traits so that you can fit in and be socially accepted. A little bit of this is necessary to survive out there in the neurotypical world, and if we dropped our masks completely, many of us would lose our jobs, destroy relationships, and just generally be unable to function. So as you can see, there are lots of reasons why diagnoses were delayed or missed in the past, but as information about neurodivergence is becoming more mainstream, less cases are being missed, resulting in higher rates of diagnosis. And thank all the gods for that, because another thing that we're learning about are the lasting impacts of missed or delayed diagnoses. It's never too late to get diagnosed if you're able to. I want to start off this section by saying that being able to pursue a diagnosis as an adult is a privilege. The only reason I was able to do it is because I was lucky enough to get a very wonderful job with very generous benefits, for which I am incredibly grateful every day. But many people don't have access to those resources, and I didn't either for a long time. There's debate out there about whether self-diagnosis is legitimate when it comes to neurodivergence. I'm not a psychologist, but I absolutely believe it is. You know yourself better than anyone, and if you relate to the challenges and experiences of neurodivergent folk, if it seems like all your friends and family are neurodivergent, and if you find that strategies for managing executive dysfunction make a difference in your life, then chances are you're probably neurospicy too. There's a growing body of research on the lasting impacts of missed or late diagnoses on individuals. Those of us who are diagnosed later in life are often dealing with decades of trauma because growing up in a world that wasn't built for you and sometimes actively discriminates against you means that you're repeatedly having to face immense challenges without the appropriate support systems. According to the stats, trauma is basically a rite of passage for neurodivergent people, and without a diagnosis, we're more likely to internalize our trauma and blame ourselves for being weird or lazy or irresponsible or antisocial or naive or otherwise bad in some way, which of course just sets us up for more victimization and trauma. On the other hand, when we know that we're just living with a neurodivergent condition and when we understand what neurodivergence is, we can then separate ourselves from those experiences a little bit more and internalize them a little bit less. As I mentioned before, our difficulties with executive functioning, sensory input, and delayed processing often get us labeled as lazy, incompetent, careless, rigid, awkward, antisocial, cold, and sometimes even narcissistic or too sensitive. As a result of these misconceptions, we lose jobs and relationships in record numbers, leading to emotional turmoil, burnout, and trauma. When we're not aware that we're neurodivergent because we haven't been diagnosed, we end up internalizing these misconceptions and believing that we really are lazy, careless, incompetent, etc. This obviously has huge implications for our self-worth and can lead us to burnout, shut down, and carry that trauma for the rest of our lives. Those of us who are diagnosed later in life or not diagnosed at all have had to deal with years and years of being misunderstood by society and by those around us, resulting in mistreatment and abuse, both of which autistic people in particular face in very high numbers compared to the rest of the population. In 2018, Daniel Hoover, a child and adolescent psychologist at the Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, reviewed a number of studies that had been done over the past 2 decades on the prevalence of bullying among autistic kids. He found that 40 to 90% of children with autism are victims of bullying compared with 10 to 40% of neurotypical children. An NIH study from 2023 also found that adults with autism are 87% more likely to experience domestic violence, including repeated instances. One thing about autism is that it can make you unaware of danger. This isn't true for everyone because autistic people aren't a monolith, but a lot of us aren't aware when someone else might not have the best intentions for us because part of autism is struggling with perspective taking. We want the best for everyone we meet, so why wouldn't everyone we meet also want the best for us? Another common autistic trait is the tendency to take people at face value and assume that everyone always says exactly what they mean, just like we do. If someone is acting friendly and nice, then they must really be friendly and nice. You see where this could become dangerous, not because of us, but because of other people and the choices they're making and how we can't interpret it correctly. A story about autism and abuse that was featured in an issue of The Transmitter, which is an American neuroscience publication, was particularly heartbreaking. It speaks so well to the autistic experience of assuming others always mean well that I just had to share it. Parents sometimes notice instances of bullying that their autistic children might not. When P was in elementary school, for example, his peers made him the designated prisoner in a game of cops and robbers. A middle school yearbook years later included a picture of him in a stockade during a field trip to Colonial Williamsburg. The selection stung Nestor because multiple adults must have had to approve that picture, which she felt preserved P as the weird kid for posterity. It's not bullying, but it sure is on that slippery slope, Nestor says. He didn't understand it. He was just happy to be included. Neurodivergent people also face a number of barriers and challenges in the workplace that can lead to trauma. According to studies by Golden Steps ABA, an autistic-centered therapy group, up to 85% of adults with autism in the U.S. are under or unemployed. The main drivers of this bleak statistic are a lack of reasonable accommodations in the workplace, misconceptions and stigmas about autism, and a lack of awareness among employers about the unique strengths and talents of autistic folk. A 2008 study found that adults with ADHD are 30% more likely to have chronic issues with employment, and ADD.org states that 1 in 3 adults with ADHD are unemployed at any given time because of a lack of support and understanding for their ADHD symptoms.
I have a sexual example for you for what it's like to have ADD. I said having ADD is like having erectile dysfunction of the mind. If the task you're trying to do is something that turns you on, you're up for it and you can perform. But if the task you're trying to do is not something that's intrinsically interesting, if it doesn't turn you on, you can't get it up. But if you can't get it up, you're not going to be able to perform. And in that situation, it does not matter how much you may say to yourself, I need to, I really ought to, I should. You can't make it happen because it is simply not a willpower kind of thing. And I think that is the most difficult problem that most people have in understanding this disorder, because it looks for all the world as though it is a problem with willpower. You can do it here, why the hell can't you do it there? When in fact, it's not. It's a problem with the chemistry of the brain.
Losing jobs because of your neurodivergence is also traumatic. Carl Van Horn, a professor of public policy and an expert on workplace and unemployment policy, states that losing a job and being unemployed for a long period of time is a psychological trauma and a financial trauma, and the two are closely intertwined. Mental health support can be life-saving. Chia Hui Wu, the chair in organizational psychology at Leeds University Business School in England, co-authored a body of research on the effects of long-term unemployment. Wu says that chronic job insecurity can lead to such impacts on personality change because it reinforces a negative self-reinforcing loop over time. For example, he says, the anxiety related to job insecurity can lead people to pay more attention to the uncertain aspects of their job and life, which in turn often distracts them from tasks that could help reduce job insecurity, so the anxiety continues. The longer the stretch of unemployment, the worse people tend to fare, with those who are out of work for 6 months or more experiencing the worst outcomes. The stories of those of us who are diagnosed later in life often follow a similar pattern. Autism and ADHD are often only identified in adults after their children are diagnosed with one or both conditions. But those of us without children are often pushed to seek a diagnosis after experiencing burnout caused by the demands and challenges of life, outstripping our ability to cope with them. Most often, these demands and challenges are work-related. According to the social model of disability, which I talked about earlier in this video, the struggles of people with ADHD and autism are a reflection of a mismatch between themselves and their environment. Changes in employment status or in the workplace itself can make this mismatch even worse and exceed our coping capacities. Common workplace changes that can result in challenges, job loss, and burnout for neurodivergent folk include an increase in workload because of layoffs, unfilled vacancies, or otherwise taking on someone else's responsibilities, for example, covering someone's parental leave. A change in responsibilities that leads to increased social or other demands that can dysregulate the nervous system, for example, multitasking, interruptions, or having to step in and lead a team. Reorganizations leading to new reporting lines and work responsibilities. This could mean a change of managers or management status, increased workload, or having to move to a different office. A new manager who's less flexible, empathetic, or competent. Increased social demand from a new manager or coworker. Change in responsibilities requiring more customer contact. Change in organizational climate, specifically an increase in political behavior or within organization competition, bullying and increased organizational permissiveness of bullying, being moved from a private office to an open office or into an otherwise taxing sensory environment, for example, a colder building with no ability to regulate or control the temperature, or a spot where the lights are brighter or there are more people around. If you're a neurodivergent person who's not aware of your neurodivergence, it can be really easy to attribute these things to the workplace and then assume it's not a good fit and then move on. But when it happens over and over and over again at different workplaces and in different environments, you start to suspect that maybe it's you and maybe there's something deeper going on, or you just can't take it anymore, or a combination of both, so you seek out a diagnosis. Then you find out that you're on the spectrum and it is just you, but also there's nothing actually wrong with you. You just live in a world that's deeply and actively hostile to your needs as an autistic person. Getting a diagnosis as an adult can be a very emotional experience, and it can bring on a range of feelings from relief to regret. It can be hard to come to terms with the fact that you're running with an invisible handicap and that no matter how hard you try, it was never going to work anyway because you're wired differently and the world wasn't built for you. It can bring on a lot of increased self-awareness and self-acceptance as you realize that a lot of the things you blamed and shamed yourself for failing at weren't because of any personal shortcomings, but because you're a neurodivergent person living in a neurotypical world. It can also bring on anger and grief that some of your most painful experiences could have been avoided if you'd been diagnosed earlier in life and received the support you needed to thrive from the get-go. What led me to seek a diagnosis? I decided to pursue a diagnosis for much the same reason as nearly everyone else does. I was struggling with changes and transitions related to work and life. Employment has always been challenging for me. I remember getting my first job in high school shelving books at the public library and feeling suffocated and stuck and trapped after 5 minutes of being at work because I wasn't allowed to leave for 8 hours. I struggled with having to follow other people's schedules and having to essentially stay in one room until I was told I could leave. Even though it was a good job and I genuinely enjoyed the work, it felt like a prison where I was trapped in an overwhelming sensory overload nightmare and constantly being bombarded by strangers asking me questions. There was no privacy and nowhere to go to escape all the people when I felt like I was drowning. My after-school shifts were especially painful because school was extremely dysregulating, and after a whole day of working really hard to not have anxiety meltdowns, I then had to go force myself to feel trapped and bombarded for 5 more hours when I was already mentally and emotionally exhausted from having been at school all day. I thought I just hated customer service jobs, and who doesn't, right? So I continued to do them, dreaming of the day when I would be able to work in an office where I could have privacy and peace and quiet and eat when I was hungry and go to the bathroom when I had to go and get up and leave if I needed to. Then when I was in my late 20s, I finally got an office job, and surprise, surprise, it was no better. It was always too cold. My desk was in an open area where people were always buzzing around, so I constantly felt like I was a little bug trapped under a microscope with people peering at me all day long. The lights were too bright, the air was too dry, and it was never properly explained to me exactly what I should be doing all day long or how I should be doing it. There were all these unwritten, arbitrary social rules that no one told me about, but that I got in trouble for not following. I struggled to maintain jobs because of this, and I always just assumed I was lazy or careless or bad in some way. About 6 years ago, I got a job that was very overwhelming, just like all my other jobs had been, but the difference was that I had a very supportive boss who was also neurodivergent. I lasted about 6 years there, and during COVID, we went fully remote, so for the last 4.5 years, I've been working entirely from home, which has been wonderful. After about 2 years at that job, I had pretty much gotten everything out of it that I could, but I stayed another few years after that because I was thriving working from home. I could actually concentrate on my work instead of having to expend a ton of energy dealing with a constantly dysregulated nervous system, and I could take breaks when I needed to, and I could control my environment, and I didn't feel like anyone was watching me or keeping tabs on me, and when my workday was done, I was actually done and I could turn it off and go concentrate on my special interests. I knew for a long time that I needed to find another job, but the thought of having to go on interviews and change up my routine and pretend to be normal and then adjust to a whole new work environment and culture that I would have to blindly navigate was overwhelming, and I dreaded having to put myself through that profound anxiety, so I avoided it for as long as I could. And then an opportunity came my way that was just too awesome to pass up, so I took it. And it was absolutely the right move. I love my new job and the people I work with, and the work that I do is positive and hopeful and good for the world. On top of that, the workplace is quite neurodivergent friendly, and the work itself is steady, predictable, and doesn't leave me having to guess at what to do. Expectations are very clear and very explicitly laid out, so I never have to guess at things that are unspoken. Even though I was so happy and excited to get this job, and even though it's such a good fit in so many ways, I still struggled a lot with the transition. I'd had the same routine every single day for the past 4.5 years, and all of a sudden everything was different. I had to eat and sleep at different times. I had to be away from home all day for 3 days a week. I didn't have as much time to engage with my special interests, and the effort it took to have to mask all day drained me so completely that it would take days and days to recover from just one day in the office. I found myself having full-on meltdowns every week, sobbing into my pillow until 2 a.m. It felt like profound grief over the loss of my old routine and the fact that the rest of my life outside of work was going to look like bare minimum survival from now on. When I wasn't in the office, the only thing I really wanted to do or had any energy for was to sit on the floor and play Candy Crush on my phone. I didn't have the energy for socializing or yoga or taking my dog for walks or connecting properly with my partner. I was even starting to lose interest in my special interests, and that was devastating. For us, a special interest isn't just a hobby, it's a lifeline. I read once that for those of us with autism, our special interests are as vital to our mental health and overall well-being as socializing is for neurotypical folk. People with autism don't generally need social time, and many of us view spending time with other people the same way neurotypical people view their hobbies, as something that can be nice if you have the time and you find the right ones, but it's not a priority nor a necessity. Our special interests, on the other hand, are for many of us a lifeline and absolutely vital to our ability to function. Not for all autistic people, again, we're not a monolith, but certainly for many of us. Not being able to engage with our special interests can seriously impact our mental health in the same way that being isolated seriously impacts the mental health of people who aren't autistic. For those of you who struggled with isolation during COVID lockdowns, that's exactly how it feels when the demands of life interfere with our special interests. It can cause extreme anxiety, depression, burnout, and eventually a lack of functioning. I describe it to my partner as feeling like I'm underwater being tossed around by a riptide and my lungs are burning and my fight or flight is activated and I desperately need to take a breath of air, but every time I surface, someone shoves me back under the water. It wasn't just a case of this is new and my body just has to get used to it. I was never going to get used to it because you don't just get used to a constantly dysregulated nervous system. What I was feeling and experiencing was unsustainable, and I knew that something was wrong. For the first time in my life, I couldn't just assume it was because my job wasn't a good fit, because I love my job, and in so many ways it is a good fit, and I'm grateful to be there. And also, I was heading for burnout. I couldn't afford to not function, and in order to protect my mental health and preserve my ability to keep working, I needed to get serious about my limits, start accepting them, and figure out how to work around them. I knew I needed some sort of accommodation in order to do well at work and not suffer for it. The first step in that process was assessment and diagnosis. I had suspected for quite a few years that I might be neurodivergent, but up until now, I was okay with not knowing for sure. I figured I had survived this long without a diagnosis, and I don't feel comfortable with taking medication, nor did I need any accommodations for a long time because I worked remotely, so there was no reason to pay a lot of money for a piece of paper telling me something I pretty much knew already. I contacted an ADHD and autism center in the city where I live. They're fantastic. I'll link to them below, and I was able to get the process started fairly quickly. It consisted of 3 separate diagnostic interviews conducted by 2 different doctors, and each one was about 2.5 hours long. I was interviewed about my symptoms and how they've affected me both in childhood and now, and the doctors walked me through several questionnaires. I had initially gone in asking about an ADHD diagnosis, but the first doctor who assessed me said that I was exhibiting more autistic traits than ADHD, although she could see that ADHD was also present, and that she wanted to prioritize the autism assessment. I was surprised because autism wasn't something I thought I had, mostly because I don't have major sensory issues, or so I thought. I don't feel like my head is splitting open when I hear noises that are too loud, nor do I feel physical pain from bad lighting. Turns out I was taking the sensory issues thing very literally, which is another autistic trait, and what doctors actually define as sensory issues can be, but often aren't, that dire. Turns out sensory issues are also things like never finishing a beverage, because by the time you get to the last sip, it's either too cold if it's a hot beverage or too warm if it's a cold beverage. Keeping all the lights low or off early in the morning because the sight of yellow light before sunrise makes you irrationally angry for some reason. Feeling physically nauseous at the weird orange glow of streetlights. Feeling like you got shot in the chest by a bullet if you hear a sudden noise right before falling asleep. Having your brain get hijacked by droning background noises like vacuum cleaners and lawnmowers to the point where you literally cannot think about or concentrate on anything else, and then getting really irritated about it. Refusing to eat ice cream after it melts because that's disgusting. Hating condiments like ketchup and relish because they make foods look messy and they completely take over the flavor of the actual food. Hating when the different foods on your plate touch. Absolutely hating being cold to the point where being cold makes you irrationally angry. And also not being able to feel things like boiling water on your skin, because turns out sensory issues can also sometimes mean being oblivious to sensory input. Check. My diagnosis. So I'm going to read to you what my actual diagnosis says, and I will include a screenshot somewhere here on the screen. To whom it may concern, Megan Sandor has been diagnosed with ASD level 1 and ADHD primarily inattentive moderate by the registered diagnostician at the ADHD and Spectrum Center. Thank you. There it is, my official diagnosis. I also have a PDA profile of autism. PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance or persistent drive for autonomy, as some prefer to call it, but PDA isn't diagnosable at this point, so it's not part of my official diagnosis. I'll probably do another video on PDA at some point because it's one of the most challenging things about being neurodivergent in my experience, but basically what all this means is that my brain is a little bit spicy. There's just a little extra dash of cayenne in there. My brain doesn't always or even usually want to do what I want it to do, and most days getting my brain to do important life things like wake up on time or write one sentence in less than 3 hours feels like herding cats. By the time I've managed to pin my brain down to whatever task is at hand, I'm so exhausted from the effort of doing that I can barely do said task at all. I have to be deeply, deeply interested and internally motivated in order to get things done, and when I do feel like that about something, I can lock into it and hyper-focus like a laser beam on it for hours and hours. I don't have any control at all over what my brain decides to focus on, and it can feel really random to me. If you've been a viewer of this channel since the beginning, you'll know that I'm a pretty avid sewist. That's because I literally woke up one day in November of 2020, went, you know what, I feel like sewing Marie Antoinette's chemise gown, and then I did, and then I didn't stop sewing for 5 years. Once my brain locked into it, I physically could not stop. This is one way that, for me, the combined autism and ADHD show up. The impulsive interests that pop into my brain out of nowhere, followed by an intense focus and drive to go deep, deep into them. A lot of my special interests are cyclical or passing. Since childhood, these have included books, horses, American Girl dolls, Sailor Moon, history, disease pandemics, Irish dance, the French Revolution, the annexation of Hawaii, Lord of the Rings, Haudenosaunee culture, ancient Egypt, Marxism, labor rights and organization, the disease pathology of ancient Egyptian mummies, astrology, textile conservation, historical fashion, the metaphysical properties of crystals, and sewing, just to name a few. A couple of these intense and all-consuming interests have been present in my life since childhood, like my deep love of history and notably my obsession with Marie Antoinette and the French Revolution. I've read every book ever written about Marie Antoinette in the English language, fiction and nonfiction, as well as a few that were translated from French. Even though I've never pursued this interest at a higher academic level, I guarantee that my knowledge on the subject could rival that of any PhD. I'm not saying that to brag. I know very little about a very great number of things, but this thing in particular, I know a lot about. When I'm deep into a special interest, it's almost impossible for me to switch my focus to something else, and when I'm forced to because life requires me to pay attention to things like chores and work and other people, it can feel suffocating, irritating, and even a bit existential, and this is where the demand avoidance comes in. Depending on how time-consuming, thought-consuming, and energy-consuming the outside demand is, I'll start to feel like my mind is being trapped and held hostage, and that will spike my anxiety to almost unbearable levels because I need to be able to let my mind be free to wander where it wants to wander and chew on what it wants to chew on. Physical demands usually aren't a huge strain for me, especially if I can do them in relative seclusion without a lot of people around. It's why I've never really struggled to get chores done, because chores don't feel like a huge mental demand in the same way as commuting or being around other humans or having to concentrate on a school assignment that was given to me by someone else that I may or may not be intrinsically interested in. Here are just a few more ways that AuDHD affects me and my life, and if you can relate to any or all of these, definitely consider that you might be a little neurospicy yourself. Pathological demand avoidance that can be disabling, a constantly dysregulated nervous system that's only regulated after days and days in low demand isolation with zero social contact or having to leave the house, a need for order and control in my environment to the point of having weird rules around how the bed is made or where the empty water glasses go before taking them downstairs into the kitchen. Yet, paradoxically, the insides of all my drawers and closets are just giant piles of clutter without any organization at all. Needing to keep new things that I buy, from toiletries to groceries to clothes, in my line of sight so that I remember I bought them, i.e. struggles with object permanence. A lack of motivation to socialize when I'm feeling burned out. Intense, obsessive, and all-consuming interests, some that have been with me since childhood and some that come and go seemingly at random with zero control over what they are or when they come and go. Impulsivity, especially when it comes to my special interests. Struggles with finances and money, which is something I have a lot of shame about. Trouble knowing what my body needs or recognizing how my body feels. This is called interoception, and it's a common autistic trait. I don't know that I'm tired until I'm so exhausted that I physically cannot stay awake, and this affects my sleep because I often don't go to bed on time because I don't realize how tired I am. It also affects my appetite in that I don't know if I'm hungry or thirsty until I'm desperate for food or water. Another weird and unpleasant manifestation of this is not knowing when I'm about to throw up, so I almost never make it to the bathroom, which is horrible for myself and anyone else who happens to be there. Being really clumsy and frequently tripping over things, dropping things, or banging into things. This is called proprioception, and it's common in both autistic and ADHD folk. The ability to hyperfocus on a task for hours and hours if it's something that makes my brain happy. This is a superpower that both ADHD and autistic folk can have, and it's one of the aspects of my neurodivergence that I really enjoy. Synesthesia, which is involuntarily associating sounds, numbers, letters, days of the week, and months of the year with colors and shapes. I'll likely do an episode about synesthesia at some point, but it's also fairly common among autistic folk. This is another aspect of my neurodivergence that I really enjoy. Musical anhedonia, which is a profound indifference towards music unless it's something that relates to or reminds me or prompts deeper thinking about my current special interest. Most music I don't really care for, and I could go years and years without listening to any music at all and it wouldn't bother me. Not really feeling like I need friends. This is something that I used to judge myself a lot for because in general, I find concepts and ideas a lot more interesting than people. I do have a handful of friendships that I cherish, all of them with other neurodivergent folks, but I've never felt like I needed to socialize or have a lot of friends, and I've always been happiest spending time by myself with my special interests. A very big imagination. I've never lost the intensity and vivacity of my imagination the way most neurotypical people do when they grow up. In fact, as I've gotten older, my imagination has only become richer with experience, needing to keep things as new as possible for as long as possible. When I was a kid, this would translate to not changing the clothes on my dolls until it felt like I'd had them for a long enough time. Having very strict categories for things. When I was a kid, I never ever dressed my American Girl dolls in clothes that weren't from their proper time periods. For those of you familiar with the characters, this means that I never would have put Samantha in Felicity's clothes or my Today dolls in any historical clothes. And it upset me profoundly to see other people mixing and matching clothes from different time periods on their dolls. I also can't eat food from different categories mixed together. For example, a strawberry dipped in balsamic vinegar is disgusting and horrible because strawberries are dessert and balsamic vinegar is dinner. But a salad with a balsamic vinegar dressing and strawberries in it is okay because then they become the same food, salad, with the same category, dinner. I have rules like this for nearly everything, and most of them are completely subconscious, so I never would have thought that they could be autistic traits because most of the time I'm not even aware of them unless they're broken, and then I get upset, and then I hide the fact that I'm upset, and then I get anxiety. Not being able to regulate my body temperature very well. I'm always cold, and I hate being cold. Like, it feels existential to me, and when I am cold, I cannot concentrate on anything else, which is another reason why I sometimes dread going outside the house, because I know that as soon as I step outside, I am never going to be warm enough. And when I'm cold, it takes over my brain. Like, I cannot think about anything else other than how cold I am, which is extremely irritating. And sometimes it's even scary, like it feels existential. So being cold is a sensory nightmare for me. Really intense emotions that take over my brain and that I sometimes subconsciously dissociate from because if I let myself feel them all the way, it would be too overwhelming. Not being able to sit in chairs properly. I've always preferred sitting on the floor to sitting on a couch or a chair, and when I do have to sit in chairs, I sit cross-legged in them or with one leg tucked up under me. This is part of the reason why being in the office can sometimes feel overwhelming. The amount of energy it takes to deal with the discomfort of forcing myself to sit in a chair properly all day long is exhausting in and of itself. Struggling to stay on task unless I'm doing something that I'm genuinely, intrinsically, and deeply interested in. Sometimes it can take me 3 to 4 hours to write one sentence if I'm not genuinely passionate about whatever it is I'm writing, which is why I have like a million books in my head that I've never quite managed to finish. Chronic procrastination and not being able to start anything unless there's a deadline looming. Getting easily overwhelmed by things like filling out paperwork, waiting in line, and taking care of mundane tasks. Absolutely zero stress tolerance because my nervous system is constantly overloaded, so anything additional is quickly overwhelming. Getting overwhelmed and burned out by too many back-to-back activities. As a kid, my nervous system was always fried because my parents, with the best of intentions, enrolled us in a ton of extracurricular activities, so I was always on the go. School during the day, and then a lesson or Girl Guides meeting or choir rehearsal and piano practice in the evening, and then homework, and then straight to bed to get up and do it all over again. The weekends offered very little relief because then there were more activities and chores on Saturdays, church and youth group and choir practice and homework, and more chores and homework on Sundays. And then it was Monday, and then the week started all over again, plus expectations from friends to socialize with them on top of all of that. I burned out really hard in university and almost failed out of my third year classes because by the time I was 20, I had been doing this constant grind for so many years that I crashed and burned and just could not do it anymore. I honestly feel like I'm still recovering from childhood activities. Being chronically late because I struggle to transition away from a task that I'm doing when it's time to leave, and or I can't leave the house until everything feels right and I've done everything in my routine in the proper order. If I don't do this, it'll cause me anxiety for the entire time that I'm gone, and I won't be able to be fully present and alert for whatever I'm doing. An inability to regulate my focus on detail. This one is mostly related to my ADHD, and it shows up as a general struggle with paying attention to detail unless it's a special interest, in which case I pay way too much attention to detail. I have zero control over this, and it deeply upsets me that it's perceived by others as being a form of carelessness, because it's not. It's literally just my brain short-circuiting somehow and registering the wrong information. This has always been one of the most challenging aspects of life for me, because I will literally read some small detail like a word or a number or a date on an invitation over and over and over again, and then somehow my brain still logs the incorrect information. This one is especially debilitating and heartbreaking for me because I've lost jobs and friendships over it, and it's not because I don't care, it's because my brain struggles to hold on to small bits of information, even when they're really important, unless I'm deeply passionate about that information. Even simply caring about something isn't enough. I have to be deeply intrinsically motivated. I can remember every single date and detail related to Marie Antoinette's life, down to the exact shade of green on the lining of the box that brought her shoes to her every morning, but I can't remember that Sunday is garbage night or that I booked that appointment for 1:30 p.m. and not 3. Just before Christmas, my partner and I were invited to a mutual friend's house for a holiday gingerbread house decorating party. We were both really looking forward to it and put it in our calendar weeks in advance. The day of, we got all dressed up and got the food that we were bringing loaded up in the car, and halfway through the hour-long drive to our friend's house, we got a message from her outlining important things to remember about the party tomorrow. In a panic, I double-checked the invitation, and sure enough, it said Sunday, not Saturday. Somehow we had both read the correct date, and then both of our brains just overwrote it somehow and logged it as Saturday instead of Sunday. We ended up driving into the city since we were halfway there anyway and just had a nice day to ourselves. We drove in again the next day to go to the party, and both somehow completely missed the memo that we were also supposed to bring gingerbread house decorating kits. ADHD. Difficulties with recognizing or sensing danger. This is more of an autistic trait, and it's related to the constellation of difficulties surrounding social interactions and perspective taking. My entire life, I've tended to assume that people have theirs, mine, and others' best interests at heart, and that most people mean well, unless they're obviously cartoonishly evil. I always mean well, so why wouldn't everyone else, is how the subconscious thinking tends to go. I have a lot of shame around this because when I was younger, people would say things to me like, "Don't be so naive, Megan," in this really exasperated, frustrated tone, and then I would feel ashamed about having somehow missed something that I should have known, even though it wasn't explicit. This is a lot of the reason that I'm drawn to edgier indie sleaze punk aesthetics as an adult, because I seem to lack that internal mechanism that warns other people when someone is up to no good. So if I can look tough and intimidating, maybe that will deter people who don't have my best interests at heart. This particular struggle doesn't just take the form of taking everyone at face value, however. It can also look like walking alone at night with headphones on and thinking nothing of it, or jaywalking on a busy street. It's not that I'm getting any sort of thrill or adrenaline rush from these things. I'm just usually so lost in my own little world that I don't even recognize or sense a dangerous situation. This is one of those things that exemplifies why every autistic person has support needs, even when they don't appear autistic. I really should have a support person when I'm out and about so that I don't get run over, and honestly, it's kind of a miracle that I've survived this long. Intense and random derealization, depersonalization episodes where all of a sudden the world feels hyper real while I feel like I'm not even here, or like I've floated out of my body. Thankfully, this doesn't happen as much anymore, but when I was a kid, they happened all the time, and it was terrifying because I didn't have the language to explain what was happening, so I would just start screaming and crying because I was so freaked out, and then I would get in trouble with my parents and teachers for being disruptive or throwing a tantrum. spectrum. I have a very vivid fantasy world that I made up in my head when I was a kid, and it's very detailed and elaborate. There are characters with names and personalities and backstories, detailed settings down to the unique characteristics of all the flora and fauna, and there are different cultural groups and traditions. I even made up my own language, and a lot of my internal monologue is in this language. As I've gotten older, I've added more and more detail to this world and to the stories of all its inhabitants, and it feels more real to me than planet Earth where my body is. I made it up as a way to cope with overwhelm and stress as a kid, and I still escape to it in my head whenever I need to, which is often. When I was a kid, I used to pretend that this world was actually my real home and that it existed somewhere out there in space, and I was actually an alien from this world that it was inhabiting a human body, and my job here on planet Earth was to observe all the humans and try to blend in with them. When I told this to the psychologist who diagnosed me, she laughed and said that that's such a common autistic experience, i.e. thinking that you're an alien that's been reincarnated in a human body, that it's practically a diagnostic criteria in and of itself. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria. I'm going to do a whole episode on this at some point, but basically it has nothing to do with being rejected socially or romantically, so rejection sensitivity is a bit of a misnomer. What it actually is an outsized reaction to any kind of perceived rejection or criticism, particularly when it comes to my work, and it's essentially a trauma response that a lot of neurodivergent folk have as a result of being repeatedly rejected, ostracized, criticized, and shamed for our neurodivergence since childhood. How it shows up for me is an extreme reaction to any perceived failures on my part when it comes to work or social interactions. I read once that folks with RSD perceive positive feedback as neutral, neutral feedback as negative, and negative feedback as catastrophic, and that sums it up pretty well. It doesn't even have to be actual criticism. It can just be a simple suggestion that's meant to be helpful, but my body goes into immediate fight or flight, and I internalize it as extreme guilt for causing inconvenience to someone and being a burden, and then I start beating myself up for failing again and always letting people down, and then I go into a severe depressive episode complete with suicidal ideation that can last for days and days, not really understanding or knowing how to adjust my behavior for different settings and environments. I understand on an intellectual level that this is important to do as it's a big part of surviving in a neurotypical world, but I have no idea why or how it's important, nor do I have any idea how to do it. It's something that I have a lot of support needs around because I often need to be told explicitly how to act and what's appropriate and what's not. For example, I don't have a professional face that I put on. I'm the same person at work as I am at home, and I treat and speak to everyone the same way, regardless of whether they're my boss or my coworker or my best friend or a cashier or my family. This is an autistic trait because we sometimes have trouble recognizing or understanding hierarchies. It's not something I do to be deliberately disrespectful. I just genuinely view all humans as being fundamentally equal despite our social roles, and therefore don't adjust my behavior unless I'm explicitly told to do so. Misplacing and forgetting things all the time. This used to be a lot worse when I was younger, but as I've gotten older, I've started to develop systems for managing this by keeping important things in my line of sight or keeping my work bag always packed even when I'm not at work so that I don't have to remember to put things in it and I can just grab it and go. Hating clutter because it's overwhelming and I need a calm environment without a lot of sensory input. But at the same time, having zero organization in my drawers and closets. Literally, they're just piles of stuff because I can't ever seem to keep things organized for more than 5 seconds. Yes, there are two wolves inside of me. One is ADHD and one is autism. It was really jarring to read all of this in my longer diagnostic report, and honestly, my first thought once I'd gotten through all of it was, how the F have I survived this long? It really brought home to me just how much of my life I haven't really been mentally or emotionally present for because I was dissociating and masking so hard just to get through the day. It made me really sad to realize that so many other neurodivergent folk are just floating around out there in a constant state of overwhelm and burnout for no other reason than because our society isn't human friendly. Reading my diagnostic report also made me realize how much internalized ableism I have. Post-diagnosis. The thing about getting diagnosed that I didn't necessarily suspect or prepare myself for is that you will go through a whole range of emotions once you see that piece of paper, even if you've known for a while that your brain is different. Everyone is different and will experience it differently, but for me, it looked like first relief that there really is nothing wrong with me and that I'm not bad, I'm just neurodivergent. A lot of the shame that I've lived with my whole life just went away, and for the first time, I really truly actually felt free. I felt a level of self-acceptance that I never thought I'd be able to have. Weirdly, I also felt a whole new crop of shame as I started to realize that a lot of the people in my past who I'd assumed were friends actually weren't, and that I hadn't picked up on it at the time. Knowing that struggles with working out someone's true intentions is actually an autistic trait made me realize that all of the people in my past who had teased me and made fun of me and ragged on me weren't doing it out of good-natured affection. They had actually meant it and were bullying me, and I hadn't even noticed or picked up on the fact that I was being bullied, and in a couple of cases actually harassed. Like that story about the middle school kid who had been not quite bullied but almost that I quoted earlier on in this video, I was picked on by people I thought were friends and allies, and I didn't even realize it because I was just happy to be around them. That's been heartbreaking to come to terms with, and as much as I've been freed from the shame over my lack of executive functioning, I now have the same amount of shame about being bullied and not realizing it that I now have to work through. It's a really weird feeling to find out that you've been nursing an invisible disability your whole life and didn't know it until now. That's the thing I've struggled the most to wrap my head around. I feel angry sometimes that I wasn't able to get diagnosed and get the help and support I needed when I was a kid, because if I had, I could have avoided a lot of the really damaging and traumatic situations that I found myself in as an adult. Thinking of myself as a disabled person has been freeing in so many ways, but it's also been difficult because it's made me realize that there will always be things that I will struggle to do, things that should be easy but aren't, like driving. I've also started realizing just how much internalized ableism I have and how much I've been beating myself up my whole life for not being able to do the things I should be able to do. That's also been equal parts liberating and heartbreaking, as I've been coming to the realization that these things aren't my fault, and that if I'd known sooner that I'm neurodivergent, I wouldn't have had to suffer through so much self-imposed shame and lack of self-worth. I'm going to do a whole video about internalized ableism probably after this one because I think it's really important to talk about. There isn't a lot on YouTube currently about how neurodivergent people, especially those of us diagnosed as adults, struggle with internalized ableism, and I want to explore this in a lot more depth. Originally, I wanted it to be part of this video, but once I started researching it, I quickly realized that there's way too much embedded in this topic to be able to do it justice without its own separate video. I also wanted to include other voices, stories, and perspectives that aren't mine, so I put a call out to my networks for other neurodivergent folks to share their stories and experiences with internalized ableism. If this is you and you also struggle with it, I'd love to hear your story. If you're interested and you're comfortable with me sharing it in a video, you can comment on this video or DM me on Instagram and tell me how internalized ableism affects you, what it means to you, and what your biggest challenges are with living in a neurotypical society. If you do, please also let me know if you're okay with me sharing your first name, and if not, please specify that you'd like to remain anonymous. You can also share your pronouns and your neurodivergent conditions if you'd like, but you also don't have to. As I explore and learn more about neurodivergence, I'm going to be posting more videos about it because special interest info dumping is also a neurodivergent trait. Some of the things I've been diving into and will do videos about in the future are internalized ableism, why so many queer people are also neurodivergent, specifically why so many asexual people are also autistic, pathological demand avoidance, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, the 3 levels of autism and their different support needs, how ADHD is different in girls and women, and intersectionality and neurodivergence. If these are topics you'd be interested in, then definitely stick around, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. I keep forgetting to mention that in my videos lately, but with all the stuff going on right now in the tech world regarding oligarchy and authoritarianism, your support of this channel matters even more. Side quest about algorithms. So we don't know how algorithms work. This information has never been publicly shared, yet every single content creator on every single platform is at the mercy of them. Almost everyone at the head of all these platforms are rich tech billionaires who are seizing power and control at alarming rates, and it's getting harder and harder for content that doesn't align with their agendas to be seen. If you enjoy content like this, it's really important to support the creators who make it and engage with our platforms so that we don't get buried by these algorithms. I encourage you to support by liking and subscribing not just my channel, but all the channels of all the YouTubers and TikTokers and Instagrammers whose content you love. It seems like a small thing, but it has a really big impact, so thank you for considering it. That's going to do it, my loves. This video has been a bit weird and off the cuff, but it's important to talk about neurodivergence because it intersects with feminism and queerness in such profound ways that I can't not talk about it. I'm looking forward to doing more videos about this, but until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and that you take care of yourselves as best you can, and elbows up, Canada. See you in the next one. Toodaloo!